The session that we're looking at is addressing values in culture. While all of us who work in cultural heritage management understand the intrinsic value of heritage resources, we are often challenged to articulate those values, often in economic terms, to audiences that might not share our point of view. This session will explore how cultural heritage and the conservation thereof is valued and articulated by conservators and others under both normal circumstances and in the face of disaster. So the first thing that I would like to do is to introduce our panelists today. First of all, I should say that unfortunately my co-presenter, Dr. Dave OBrien, is not able to be with us today, so I will be presenting some of his economics. Our Dr. OBrien is a lecturer at the Cultural and Creative Industries Department at City University, London. He specializes in cultural value and urban cultural policy issues and has a PhD in sociology from the University of Liverpool. His undergraduate degree is in history and politics, and his master's was in philosophy. He unfortunately couldn't be with us today. Our next presenter, our panelist, is Dr. James Janowski. Dr. Janowski is a philosopher at Hampton, Sydney, a Virginia liberal arts college, dating back to 1775. Professor Janowski teaches Intro to Philosophy, Ethics, Social Philosophy, and Philosophy of Art. He is interested in applying philosophy to important practical concerns, and he also teaches a course that considers the prospects for restoring degraded value, whether in the natural world or the artificial world. Professor Janowski's research addresses the issues that arise in thinking about the conservation of cultural heritage. Like the talk he gave at the last year's AIC meeting, his recent publications have focused on Afghanistan's Bamiyan Buddhas, sculptures that were blown up by the Taliban in 2001. Professor Janowski is working on several projects, including a book in which he aims to both answer the question, should the Bamiyan Buddhas be restored, and make a contribution to conservation theory more generally. Our next panelist is Katie Sanderson. She is a research scholar in photographic conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She received her BA from Wesleyan University in 2000. Prior to her graduate training, she worked for Christie's and later spent several years as a collections care specialist at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. In 2011, she received her MA in art history and advanced certificate in conservation from the Conservation Center at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Her current research focuses on the study of color change in photographs over time, with particular attention paid to the effects of light exposure during exhibition. The ultimate goal of this work is to obtain more object-specific predictions for longevity and to refine exhibition policies for a variety of photographic processes. Our next panelist is Faye Wong. She received an MS in Library Science and a certificate in conservation from Columbia University in 1992. She undertook advanced internships and additional training at the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Institution Library, and the National Museum of Natural History. She was awarded a Paper Conservation Fellowship at the Conservation Analytical Lab in 1993 and 1994. Afterwards, she worked for the Conservation Analytical Lab for many years before she took a teaching position at the Tainan National University of the Arts in 1999. She is presently Associate Professor and Director at the Graduate Institute of Conservation of Cultural Relics and Museology at Tainan National University of the Arts. Those are our panelists, and I am going to be the first presenter this evening to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a PhD chemist, have been working in conservation science for about 20 years, and I work at the National Park Service. There we go, the first slide. My talk today is going to be about an interdisciplinary look at the valuation of cultural heritage in the face of disasters. Now let me give you a little background about this presentation. After the Gulf Coast oil spill last year, I was placed on a team to start looking at response and recovery for cultural heritage along the coast. In particular, we looked at Fort Livingston, which is in Grand Terra Isle. So one day I get a call up and they said, Mary, you've been chosen to write the baseline injury and assessment valuation protocol. We need to know what is the value of damages done so that we can hold the responsible parties responsible. And I'm a chemist. So the first thing I did is I tweeted all of my friends on Twitter and said, do you know anything about how to value cultural heritage? Now, in the back of my mind, there was a project that was funded in 1997 looking at acid deposition damages to cultural heritage, so I knew I had that somewhere. So, the next thing that happened is that I get a Twitter response from Dr. Dave O'Brien in the UK, and he says, what do you want to know? So that's how my working relationship with Dr. O'Brien started. Now, man-made disasters can result to injuries in cultural heritage in a variety of ways. For example, the Bamiyan Buddhas were caught in a conflict of theology. Accidents such as the Exxon Valdez and the BP Gulf oil spill result in damage to archaeological sites and objects. And then there's vandalism. There's also damage from air pollution, which I've mentioned. Laws exist that provide protection to natural and cultural heritage, but in order to hold the parties responsible, monetary damages must be assessed. What is the most appropriate ways to place value on irreplaceable cultural heritage? This is an example of vandalisms that happen in historic cemeteries. It's an area that I deal with all the time. This is what Fort Livingston looked like June 2010 after the BP oil spill. The fort was constructed in 1841 and 1842, and it was used by Confederate troops during the Civil War. The structure is made of tabby and clad in brick. The oil reached the fort in early June during high tide and the new moon and moved farther into the insides of the structure. So in art and conservation, it's difficult for us to accept the idea of placing monetary value to intangible, non-market benefits. And to do this is often confusing or off-putting. Conservators, by definition, attempt to prolong the lifetime of an object because of its significance or cultural importance. Those who do conservation work are sometimes surprised by those who don't value it. But what are the practical aspects of determining damages to a cultural object? How do we determine those damages? And particularly when the cultural object can have many types of value. One of the key problems is that the language of policymaking and governments is spoken mainly by economists. It's dominated by economics. And the way they use it is through cost-benefit analysis in terms of money. Economic value can be broken down into use and non-use values. On the price of a good, what's the willingness to pay for that good, or the willingness to pay to ensure that good's still here. And when we're talking about a good here, we're talking about cultural heritage. And non-use values are those values that we want to accept because the object continues to exist. So the key is, how do we find techniques that can work out the economic value of heritage in what people are willing to pay? The main method used to establish economic value of goods and services that don't have market prices is called contingent valuation methods. And essentially, people are asked, what would they be willing to pay for something or willing to accept if something was taken away? It's an established method that's used for evaluating the historic environment. And the images that I show here show you a study that was done in 1997 at the University of Colorado, Denver, looking at the effects of acid rain deterioration on sculpture. Basically, participants in surveys were asked how much would they be willing to pay to keep the object in the pristine conditions shown in number 1 versus a deteriorated condition in number 2, or a very deteriorated condition in number 3. Basically, we're developing a hypothetical market for the cultural object, and we're finding how much people are willing to pay. One of the more famous cases in the UK, people were asked about their willingness to pay for library, museum, and archive services in the city of North England. So they spoke to people who didn't use the library, museum, and archives, and they spoke to people who did. And they generated a value that the public held for those services. Then they looked at the public funding. By having these numbers, they could generate a cost-benefit ratio, which the local government could then use. But I have to say, and you're not going to read all of these bullets, I promise you, I have to say that there are lots of problems with this technique. Essentially, it boils down to 2 different types of problems. Objections to the rational homo economist view of people, and the technical issues about how the questions are asked. So for example, just by asking the questions, you may skew the study. And the way in which you ask the questions may skew the study. What are the consequences? Well, proponents of using these contingent valuation methods say that this is important information that can be accessible to consumers and clients, and they can motivate organizations to improve in communication, improve in the way they're giving feedback about policies, and how they're dealing with other institutions. Critics point to the harmful unintentional consequences that occur when professionals lose their discretion and actors play the test, focusing on indicators rather than on the qualities of the measurements. Essentially, what we're saying is that you're making things have a market value, and you're putting a dollar value to things that don't necessarily have dollar values. There are limits of the economic method. One of the main limits is, as I mentioned, that not all objects have an economic value, and that heritage may therefore not be a type of good that by definition has a price to attach to it. Let's say, for example, the price attached to trust by those who were damaged by the Exxon Valdez oil spill or the Gulf Coast oil spill. No amount of money that's thrown at the problem may ever rebuild that trust. The basic economic techniques can fit into a cost-benefit analysis and for decision-making but in order to support political, to provide political support. But not all values can be expressed in dollars. And the economic techniques, however, are an essential tool, but they can never capture all forms of value. So policymakers need to assert value as well as relying on social science evidence. Now, I'd just like to take a brief moment to talk about working across social media. The conservation profession can reach and learn from a new world of allied professionals through social media, as evidenced by my exchanges with Dr. Dave O'Brien, having started with a series of tweets on Twitter. The advantages are that you can learn new methods and apply them to our problems. You can access people globally. They no longer have to sit in your room. I've never spoken to Dr. O'Brien on the phone. We've only exchanged written correspondence. And there's an ease with which we can share this knowledge. However, the disadvantages are having the need to know the quality of the information that you're sharing and knowing that it's not the same as a face-to-face collaboration. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. James Janowski.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes, so I'm just going to zip right in, actually. My title slide is up. Great. I want to start out by thinking about some old metal fasteners. Imagine a very rare 18th century plate that has been restored with staples, so-called staple repair. Now imagine scientists at the Getty Conservation Institute come up with a flashy, high-tech method whereby the piece might be properly restored, this time without the addition of any non-original material. And then, happy day, a curator discovers the tiny original remains in the museum basement. Enter the Getty Tech SWAT team. Staples are excised and the small holes perfectly plugged. Imagine, too, that the break joints are made to vanish via a Getty-developed superfusion process. In short, the science is magical and works like a charm. The plate is back, consistent with its creator's intentions. What's not to like? If it is obvious to a scientifically minded conservator what should happen here, it is not at all obvious to me. In fact, I'm not sure the staple should be removed at all. Surely a number of questions arise. Look at and think about these images. Is the artwork best understood? Is it wholly and rightly explained by appeal to its original material? Using the Getty technology would reestablish the plate's former appearance, but can the artwork be reduced to its aesthetic properties? Indeed, how should we understand the artwork? And how should we understand the staples? Are the latter mere band-aids to be painlessly ripped off when, as we're imagining, the piece at long last might be authentically healed? Will the artwork pop back into existence when the staples are removed and the new technology applied? Or, alternatively, might removing the staples itself cause some pain? And isn't it possible, surely this is not obviously wrong, that the staples have become part of the piece? Plainly, this case requires us to think carefully about the nature of artworks. What kind of being do artworks have? This is a hard question, and I certainly don't have the answer. But perhaps artworks are not wholly or fully or completely understood as a matter of their original fabric alone. Perhaps they are not best understood as, here's Mark Sagoff's definition, something created once and for all by a particular person at a particular time in response to a particular problem. Instead, perhaps they are better understood as historically malleable collective projects. For Sagoff, the artist is a quasi-deity. But perhaps the artist is not so much a godlike creator, infusing some particular material with an unchangeable and metaphysically sacred form, as he or she is, much more modestly, the giver of a gift. There's no time to unpack this idea. But assuming there's something to it, recall that giving a gift involves ceding control. Thus, the artist's beneficiaries now have a say in what happens. And while thoughtful grantees will honor the grantor by not unnecessarily sullying the gift, good stewardship may require hard calls. After all, it happens. Fate may intervene in an artwork, think Michelangelo's Pietà and Laszlo Toth's Hammer in 1972, may become compromised. Sagoff actually urges that it is sometimes better to let damage stand than to restore integrally. In his view, then, it is better to leave the Pietà like this, have a look at the orange arrows, but I find this odd, and I'm on your side. Against Sagoff, the artwork's heirs may well honor the artist most fully by keeping the artwork up and running, look at the image on the right, as a working repository of meaning and value, even if this requires the addition of non-original material which in some non-trivial sense literally becomes incorporated, material which itself accretes meaning and value. So I have concerns about Sagoff's position, and I have similar concerns about what might seem science's slam dunk in the case of the stapled piece. In fact, let's go back to our old plate for a moment. Is it possible to conceive the staples as akin to patina, where patina is understood as something that comes later, via nature, keeping in mind that human beings too are part of nature? Can patina be excised without metaphysical or aesthetic or historical cost? And exactly what costs are worth bearing in order to get a patina-laced artwork back to its original state? These are difficult questions without obvious answers. But note that, sometimes anyway, patina is not removed and is thought to be essential to an artwork, considered and understood as such. Now let's think about a possible analog from the natural world. I suppose one might argue that the staples are akin to an invasive species, or perhaps that they are akin to weeds. Recall that weeds are deposited by nature, and recall that some old-fashioned mender, also a part of nature, deposited the staples. Weeds, of course, are a nuisance. Thus, my dictionary defines weed as a valueless plant growing on cultivated ground to the exclusion or injury of the desired crop. Sound familiar? Sound Sagoffian? Well, perhaps the staples are akin to an invasive species or a weed. Perhaps they don't belong in the piece, and maybe we should remove them. Before we sign on, however, let's think briefly about weeds. Sometimes weeds linger in their ecosystemic niches. Indeed, even where weeds are initially deemed a nuisance, sometimes they take root. A quick glance at the North American Dictionary of Weeds lists, among others, each of barley, basil, beets, buckwheat, corn, yes, corn, cotton, yes, cotton, cucumber, dill, mint, mustard greens, oats, yes, oats, okra, okay, fair enough, peanuts, the radish, red rice, soybeans, sunflowers, and, well, wheat as weeds. But what would we do without cotton or corn or peanuts? And at least for some, mint was a crucial ingredient on Kentucky Derby Day this past Saturday. Sometimes weeds actually come to be appreciated, in which case we stop calling them weeds and understand them instead as integral parts of an ecosystem. Indeed, sometimes we come to think of weeds as central to our lives. Sometimes they come over time to be valued. By analogy, then, it seems we might come over time to actually value the staples. Once again, look and think. Indeed, we might come over time to see the staples as part of the artwork, and we might come eventually to understand the meaning and value they harbor as well. In fact, we might have done this by now, in which case excising the staples would come at a real cost. This, at any rate, does not seem to me crazy or incoherent or flat out wrong. These are challenging issues and questions, and I do not claim to have thought them through. Indeed, my point in thinking about staples is to stress that the answers in conservation are determined not by the empirical possibilities, but rather by striving to understand and then striving to balance and adjudicate the various pertinent meanings and values. Indeed, my real point here is that conservators need to think. And I turn now to discuss why this kind of thinking is important. What is the good, or what are the goods, in the thoughtful practice of conservation? Time is precious. I'm going to merely lay out bare bones, without the connective tissue of argument, several of these goods. First, the puzzles arising in conservation. I use the book on the left in Teaching Philosophy of Art, and I'm working toward the book on the right, are inherently interesting. and grappling with them is pure pleasure, candy for the mind. Reason is part of our nature, and this kind of thinking develops the same. Therefore, we should just do it, not bashfully or shyly, but openly and proudly, showing off our stuff as rational animals and enjoying the experience. I communicate with Jim Druzik, senior scientist at the Getty. Here's a quote from a March email. System 2 stimulation is my finest source of auto-generated opiates. Druzik is right. Exercising the mind's muscles is a high. That was not planned, I promise. It makes you stronger, developing a side of your personality that smartly complements the side that likes microscopes, solvents, and answers. Second, this kind of thinking develops the personality of the profession. Indeed, theorizing about conservation, asking and seeking answers to its foundational questions, deepens the self-understanding of the discipline. And if self-understanding is good in itself, well, a deepened self-understanding is gooder. AIC is committed to advancing this kind of inquiry, and conservators themselves are doing a fine job of it at last year's meeting on critical thinking and ethics. And witnessed the exchange between Frank Matero and Salvador Munoz-Finas in recent issues of AIC News. Both are doing conservation theory in those letters. Both are working to understand the nature of a conservator's activity and thereby making conservation itself richer. Third, and crucially for this meeting, practicing conservation reflectively in effect teaches a new language, what I call the language of meaning and value, fostered by critical thinking, is different in kind from what I call the language of objects, fostered by training in science. Doubtless, learning a new language is valuable in itself, as I've urged. But learning this new idiom is also pragmatic. In fact, becoming more cognitively agile, more able to think your way around the ideas underlying the work, will foster your case-making skills and spark new synergies. How so? Well, most allied professionals will be much more adept at talk about the preservation of aesthetic and historical value than at talk about B72 and alkaloid. So some conceptual stretching on your part, becoming more nimble with the language of meaning and value, will make you a persuasive promoter of the ends of your profession. Look around. Doubtless the conservation supporters in the room are nice folk who want to be helpful. Of course, a smile is not yet a relationship. You actually need to collaborate with them. And working to develop this second fluency, learning to use their native tongue, will promote just this. Want allies and advocates? Want productive synergies? Become bilingual. Developing facility with this more colloquial language will have you forcefully conveying the import of a conservator's work. It will increase your effectiveness as spokespersons for the cause. Okay, to tally up and quickly rehearse, the thoughtful practice of conservation is a huge win-win. It serves your individual ends and the profession's ends in the various ways I've noted. And there is more. Thinking in this way will make you a better conservator, where that means you'll do more to answer to the goal of conservation, namely the maximization and perpetuation of meaning and value. And explaining the import of this points to a different dimension of the good and reflective practice. In fact, it highlights the why and the what for of the work. Conservators work with material objects, but they also work, as we've seen, with meaning and value. On one level, your concern is physical stuff. On another level, you are caring for and entrusted with something far more abstract and working toward a moral end. Indeed, what are you doing, morally speaking, when you do what you do? At least one thing, maybe two. Here's the first. While the issues here are thorny, I would say that artworks are a locus of value and a source of meaning. The values depend upon the material, and the values are accessed and meaning somehow made in the mysterious relation between a mind or a heart and the material per se. But of course, the material is fragile, and hence the values and meanings are too. Thus, conserving and restoring artworks working with the material to maintain or resuscitate the value it harbors, preserves the possibility of meaning. And so, here then is the fourth good on our list. Conservation serves an essentially moral and a very important human interest. It makes meaningful and edifying experience possible. Put simply, conservators contribute to the good in human lives. This is huge. It is an immense benefit extended to others. And of course, others here has a big, wide referent. Indeed, in maintaining value and perpetuating meaning, conservators contribute to the good in the lives of countless generations. Assuming humans stick around, conservators are facilitating meaningful experience way out into the future. But I might go even further. One could also argue that the moral import of a conservator's work is not exhausted by its instrumental value. One might also say, here goes, fasten your seatbelts, that conservation contributes to intrinsic value. What artworks do for human beings is one thing, but what they are in themselves is another. And it might have a different kind of importance, perhaps even a more important importance. Some things might be important, period. The fact that they're important for us, though true, would not fully explain their importance. Parenthetically, some have this view about nature. I think there's a case to be made for extending it to artworks. In late March, I gave a talk on philosophy and conservation at NYU. It had me thinking about the Met, and I want to close now by going back there. Imagine a wing at the Met wholly devoted to conserved and restored artworks. Lots of people go there all the time, and this because they appreciate the value in the wing. Value conservators have lovingly worked to maintain and perpetuate. Then the bird flu strikes. We're down to 5 people in NYC. All 5 visit the wing. They are moved, and they die happy. Now we're down to 1, and she is near death. This person, too, chooses to spend her last hours in this wing. She relishes the experience and then heads home, deeply satisfied by what some members of her species have done to perpetuate value. The last human reflects on the good conservators do. She smiles, and then sadly passes away. Of course, the next day the sun rises. And of course, the works are still there. Here's a question. Are they now valueless? Have they lost all their value just because they can't be seen? Many will quickly say yes. But is that right? Really? Nothing has changed in the wing itself. The works haven't changed. And so maybe they can't give rise to meaning, but have value nonetheless. Maybe the artworks in this wing are just good. Full stop. If this is correct, bend your brain, think hard, imagine it is. It would manifest the deep intrinsic import of a conservator's work. Number 5 on the slide. Of course, this thought is an extravagant one, and it might not be right. But however that goes in the end, I do have this much right. Conservators' work is hugely valuable for people. See number 4. And learning to speak the language of meaning and value, which, I'm happy to say, does not require going so far as imagining pandemics and empty museums, will propel your interest forward. Conservators do some of the most important work in the world, and thus it is altogether rightful, even crucial, to enlist allies and advocates, and then welcome them to the cause. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Catherine Sanderson.
Over the course of the last 40 years, the emphasis of museums has largely shifted away from their permanent collections towards special exhibitions. Blockbuster exhibitions with subsequent touring schedules draw large crowds of museum goers, which is a fact that's difficult to ignore for museums struggling to remain viable. Also, as many of us are aware, partnerships involving the loan of entire exhibitions in exchange for money have developed between museums and other cultural institutions, as well as for-profit corporations. Capital campaigns for ambitious expansion projects, along with the recent global recession, have also forced many museums to tighten their belts while attempting to increase or at least maintain their visitorship and their bottom line. In many cases, an attempt to conserve resources and increase income is resulting in fewer exhibitions, and on the surface, at least from our point of view, this seems like a really positive response. But as the number of mounted shows has decreased, their durations have actually increased. So although this may improve an institution's bottom line, a factor that's often overlooked is the cost to the individual artworks themselves, which comes with extending the period of display. All of this boils down to the fact that a portion of an object's life existence is spent with each instance of use. And since much of the damage incurred by art objects is cumulative and not reversible, overuse tends to lead to a larger portion of the object's lifespan being consumed. Today, I'm talking about the often overlooked status of museum objects as non-renewable resources. And to do that, I'll be drawing on the work of a long list of theorists in economics, philosophy, aesthetics, sociology, and conservation. I'm not attempting to provide concrete answers to this problem. Instead, I'm proposing a shift in our thinking about how and why we use and preserve art objects. I believe that thinking about art objects as non-renewable resources should be a fundamental philosophy for museum staff in managing their collections. And distilled down to the essential ideas, it also allows us as conservators to explain a nuanced problem in relatively simple terms to members of allied fields. The first metric of valuation that usually comes to mind when thinking about a work of art is its monetary value. Even masterpieces considered priceless are classified using that language because their monetary value is so extreme that it exceeds any figure that would reasonably fit into the context of the current art market. Karl Marx discussed the concept of objects possessing use value and exchange value. He said that use value becomes a reality only by use or consumption. In other words, the basic criterion for assessing an object's value is its essential usefulness, what it does in the way of satisfying need and wants. Some might argue that art doesn't really have use value in the utilitarian sense, but actually museums use objects all the time for exhibition, loan, and study in order to carry out their missions. In the case of exchange value, Marx explains that there is some value inherent to a commodity that makes it more or less valuable relative to other commodities. For example, gold is inherently more valuable than grain. So a small amount of gold can be exchanged for a large amount of grain. On the art market, objects maintain their exchange value within the context of the market economy. And it seems that when an institution accessions an object, it's effectively removed from the commercial market and goes through a sort of process of decommodification. Actually, I think the object enters a new sort of market within the sphere of art museums, which I call the museum market. Each art object in this museum market has its own use value and corresponding exchange value with regard to current museum practices. For example, institutions have long engaged in reciprocal lending. In this scenario, the exchange value of objects within the museum market is central to defining this transaction. The loan of a masterpiece may not be considered equal to the loan of a single lesser-known work by the same artist, but another masterpiece, or maybe a group of lesser-known works, may come closer to the value of the initial loan. Of course, art objects possess more than just monetary value. In fact, an individual object has multiple values that may change with time and context, such as historical or associative value, among many, many others. Since museum objects no longer function as commodities on the global market, their worth within the museum market is determined by this range of non-monetary values, which are nearly impossible to quantify. And because of this, I think we still often use monetary value as a sort of shorthand for a much more complex valuation system. These values are woven into the identity of every object in varying proportions, and events in the history of an object will often enhance and cause shifts in value, resulting in the depth and richness that historical objects possess. We often use the analogy of a biological life system. of a biological life system when characterizing the existence of non-living objects. It's common to hear the word lifespan used to describe an object's existence, and I'm doing that today, as I'm sure others will and have. With regard to living organisms, development and aging occur at a rapid rate when we're young. This slows once we reach adulthood, as more gradual aging continues for the greatest span of our lifetime, until we reach old age, when our aging again seems to speed up and the decline is steeper. The aging of objects is roughly the inverse of this. Barbara Applebaum has adapted a scientific graph originally drawn by Robert Feller. She uses this material aging graph as a qualitative illustration of the rates of change in the duration of an object. In the induction phase, chemical and minute physical changes cause slow deterioration that isn't visible until a later time, a kind of latent damage. In the autocatalytic phase, this is the period of the most rapid aging. This stage results in visible physical deterioration. And finally, when chemical processes in the previous phase begin to exhaust themselves, the object has entered the auto-retardant phase, where deterioration still occurs, but at a much slower rate. Theoretically, this phase ends when there is no remaining evidence of the object's original fabric. Determining an object's projected lifespan is obviously not a simple task. It involves the determination of an object's rate of degradation and its position on this aging continuum, which is nearly impossible to do. So most conservators establish projections through educated assumptions about an object's aging properties, and our knowledge is constantly improving through continued research conducted by scientists and conservators. With this information, general standards can be set for the acceptable use of an object. When a museum strays from those standards, however, by using an object more than the recommended amount, the museum effectively shortens the object's lifespan. Or, abandoning the context of a specific set of applied standards, the museum changes the object's entire clock. In other words, each set of standards that could be applied to the use of a given object will determine a unique or characteristic span of time that the object will occupy. Ultimately, we have the power to control that duration to a reasonable extent through implementation of and adherence to an informed exhibition policy and storage conditions. This is really the fundamental argument for conservative use of collections, but also supports the case for other preventative measures, such as cold storage and anoxic enclosures, for example. The problem is that there is no hard and fast rule for determining the ideal number of future generations that get to enjoy an object. So how do we figure out a reasonable policy for use? This is why laying down logical restrictions can be so difficult for conservators, and why those restrictions can seem arbitrary to curators. How do we reconcile the perception on the conservation side that demands on the collection are increasing with the notion on the curatorial side that restrictions on exhibition parameters are getting tighter? The causal relationship is difficult to nail down, but I think it's likely a matter of perception more than anything else. As demands on the collection increase, restrictions seem tighter, when in actuality, conservators are just doing their best to avoid overuse. Conservator or curator, though, we all need to adjust to the idea of the use and consumption of objects. It's what humans do with art, and it's inevitable. A purely utilitarian mindset in favor of profit maximization without judgment would view what we consider overuse as essential and unavoidable for the survival of the institution. And I think this is an argument we actually hear relatively often. Of course, the flaw in this logic is that the art objects being consumed by this use are really what allow for the survival of the institution on the most fundamental level. An economist would say that as some objects deteriorate, the museum is always able to acquire new art that will contribute to future income. And from a purely economic perspective, this actually may be true. The museum continues to mount exhibitions and draw visitors and income. But museums house unique works of art. What economists fail to recognize at first is that each individual object is its own non-renewable resource. Unlike for-profit corporations, museums are also motivated by an ethical mandate to preserve our cultural heritage. The moral obligations of arts institutions set us apart from the for-profit world. Reconciling this is a particular challenge when museums are run like corporations, because carrying out our mission ethically sacrifices efficiency by corporate standards. Most members of the conservation and curatorial community reject the idea of thinking about works of art as commodities. And I think this stems from the moral aspects of caring for art objects. To think of art as a mere commodity is to ignore all of the things that make it important. But to pragmatically argue for its protection, we must first acknowledge that museums don't exist in a sphere separate from modern capitalism. They operate in the same market society as the largest investment firms, and they also measure their success according to a market-related metric. For example, the success or failure of an exhibition is most often defined by monetary means, while the fundamental goal of an exhibition can't easily be measured monetarily. How can we really quantify the extent to which a given exhibition served the public? This is most often expressed through attendance numbers and externalities such as revenue generated through admission, food services, and merchandise sales. Even in the absence of admission fees, attendance records still provide quick and easy evidence of the success or failure of an exhibition without taking into account those other aspects that might increase its overall merit. But of course, the goal of museums is a noble one: to preserve cultural heritage and to provide public access to it. Remaining viable in a modern market society has become increasingly difficult, and in some cases, museums have adapted by employing leadership models that have more in common with big business than nonprofit management. Although this may sometimes lead to actions that we feel fall into moral gray areas, it's not a desire for raw profit that's driven this shift. It's about survival. One of the most significant dangers that museum collections face in this climate is the monetary benefit that profitable touring shows and longer exhibition durations provide. This short-term gain has long-term consequences that are so abstract compared with the daily operations of a museum that they often go unnoticed. The problem is that museums are actually borrowing for short-term monetary gain against the artworks themselves. And once the art has been used through travel and exhibition, the portion of its lifespan that has been spent cannot be regained. This cost, the spending of the art objects themselves, is the most overlooked externality when considering the real cost of exhibitions. Other costs of museum exhibitions include basic and quantifiable elements like the amount of time devoted to the show by curators, conservators, and other museum staff, or future conservation work, for example. And then there are additional costs that are more difficult to quantify, such as the social cost of hastening an individual object's lifespan, reducing the number of future generations who will have access to the object, and slowly eroding the depth and quality of a collection through overuse. Museum collections not only imbue their institutional homes with an inherent cultural value, but they also help to ensure a viable financial future. Spending the collection down too quickly robs future generations of access and the museum of future revenue. So without sufficient justification for use of its collection, a museum is essentially taking out a bad loan. AIC and AAM both state in their codes of ethics a dedication to preserving collections for future generations. The AAM code also states that loyalty to the mission of the museum and to the public it serves is the essence of museum work. Though for a museum to faithfully follow its mission is no simple task. In 1991, the National Bureau of Economic Research organized a conference on the economics of art museums. At the conference, sociologist Paul DiMaggio claimed that most museums lack that coherent core of undivided purpose that economists call a utility function. That is, a consistently ranked set of objectives and rules for making trade-offs among them. In other words, a museum does not lack a mission, it has too many. And among them, there is no clear hierarchy to follow. And so this tension among multiple equally important missions causes inevitable clashes. In light of the mandate to preserve collections for future generations, how do we justify the inevitable deterioration that results from the use of those collections? Likewise, how could it be considered acceptable for a museum to severely restrict access to its artworks? That might preserve the collection longer, but would cease to serve the public in any meaningful way. To manage one of these tasks perfectly means that we sacrifice the other. So a balanced approach is necessary in which museum professionals of all kinds recognize that their ultimate task is to manage these valuable, non-renewable resources. Because consciously or not, a decision is made every time an object goes on view or travels to use up a portion of its lifespan. This use is inevitable and shouldn't cause paralysis when making the decision. However, responsible choices are necessary when considering the consumption of an object. And the most responsible option is to enter into the decision-making process with the full understanding that art is a consumable entity. In fact, what we know as preservation should really be considered responsible spending. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Faye Wong, and after her presentation, we are going to hold questions until after the second keynote speaker. I just wanted to let you know that questions for the panelists will be taken afterwards.
Hi, everybody. Today, I feel very privileged and honored to be here sharing my experience with you all. As you know, I was trained to be a conservator in the US, and I learned and embraced Western conservation philosophy wholeheartedly. Just like you all, I have come to participate and to celebrate the 40th annual meeting of AIC on this special occasion. I believe that we have reached consent and agreement on the issue of conservation to a certain extent through these meetings because we communicate, discuss, sometimes with heated debates, and express our thoughts and beliefs, as well as present our ideas. We know the meaning of conservation, what should be preserved, what needs to be maintained and left alone, how to improve collection conditions, and how to extend its future use. Here we communicate based on a common ground, that is, our minds and thoughts are united in a certain way. Communication is the activity of conveying information. Successful communication enables us to understand each other by exchanging thoughts, messages, or information through speech, signals, writing, or behavior. It sounds easy and simple. However, it can be very complex, difficult, and sometimes frustrating. If barriers arise as a result of misunderstandings or even conflict in the worst situation. A barrier could be the cumbersome or even faulty bureaucratic rules and regulations that were poorly designed as a result of inefficient communication. It could be a physiological barrier due to personal discomfort, either physical or psychological. It could be due to the use of ambiguous words and phrases, which is misleading. A communication barrier could be result from the physical isolation we have from one another due to our living in many different parts of the world. Each person is confined to representing their personal experiences. Each acts creatively. This evolves into various, often very different cultures. How do these various cultures and human activities affect our conservation projects? Much have already been written about the apparent conflict in philosophies between East and West when dealing with the conservation of cultural heritage. As the modern heritage preservation movement originated in Europe, the formulator of early international charter were not as informed about non-European conditions and the values that we fortunately have the opportunity to better understand today. The NARA document on authenticity from 1994 was an attempt to acknowledge potential areas of conflict and help resolve them by fostering mutual respect and understanding between culturally diverse groups responsible for conservation, policy, and practical implementation of conservation measures. As many diverse groups are involved in various conservation projects, the conservation measurement won't be an easy task. Complexity is far more common than the regular routine that we are familiar with. Different cultures evolve with particular and distinctive values, which might not be the same as ours. When conflicts occur, the simplest explanation could be the difference between cultures. However, the conflicts need to be resolved because, in a sense, all cultural groups are striving to achieve the same simple goal, that is, to extend the life of artifacts. These artifacts were made to bring us contentment and to fulfill our basic shared human spiritual and aesthetic needs. They are here for all of us from many different cultures to appreciate, exhibit, and research. If differences cannot be resolved between a conservator and other groups, the participation of the third body, which could be government, organization, individual, or even God, might be critical in this project. In Taiwan, the Cultural Heritage Preservation Act was adopted by the presidential order in 1982. The newest one was promulgated on February 5, 2005. It contains 104 articles under 11 chapters. The act imposed by the legislative body served as guidance and resolution while conflict occurred among groups. The value of cultural heritage was also depicted through an evaluation project formed by a group of experts under the mandate of the government. For example, Maju Temple in Tainan City. This black-faced Maju was classified as a national treasure, and the value was downgraded by the government in 2006 after treatment due to the head-fallen incidents. In the museum context, the conservation project is to follow the regulations required by the government. The department in charge of project inspection will draw the specification, evaluate potential competitors, and monitor the project after bidding. After the project is started, the museum will call for the project review committee and come to inspect the progress accordingly. The committee member might be another factor that influences the outcome of project. In regards to the temple situation, most temples in Taiwan are owned privately and guided by the management committee. Temples classified as historic buildings are under the Protection of Preservation Act. Projects of addition and renovation should be reported to the government for approval. It sounds very simple and straightforward. However, the value of the government and the values of the government and the management committee conflict from time to time. Meetings to advocate the importance of preserving and retaining the original value of artifacts become urgent. Sometimes action needs to be taken immediately, and compromise might be made to meet the needs of both sides. Here, this is the Maju actually downgraded after it has been treated during the head-fallen incidents. And here is another temple at Jiali in Tainan. This temple is famous for its lower fire glaze pottery, used primarily as a decoration in temple architecture. 3 clay sculptures situated in the temple were planned to be burned to ash, and the ash meant to be mixed with new clay as a symbol of old spirits in new ones. Among these sculptures, two were decapitated and replaced by wooden heads during the Japanese period. The 2 wooden heads and clay sculptures existing due to the significance of history made the government call for meetings quickly in order to save this sculpture. And this is a new one. After numerous periods of negotiation with the temple management group, the temple agreed not to burn the sculptures. However, the sculpture needs to be relocated. Now, the sculptures are temporarily situated at the Tainan National University of the Arts for treatment. In addition to legal imposition, individual efforts also play a significant role during project execution. The influence could be like a double-sided sword. The impact of the outcome of project could be very positive if mutual trust is developed between the individual and the conservators. Suishan Temple in Jiayi would be a good example to address all the complexities with a positive result. Mr. Lin, an architect, gains the trust by the temple management committee and serves as a long-term consultant for the temple. In 2008, the temple received partial government funding and began the conservation project of polychrome wooden components and the wall paintings. Pictures show the teachers, conservators, students involved in this conservation project. Yongqing Lin was ahead of the treatment project during that time. When different opinions occurred between conservators and the committee, Mr. Lin acted like a messenger in between. Meetings were arranged to educate and explain conservation procedures to committee members. In addition, outreach programs requested by the government were also held for the public. During the conservation period, the respect of the religious culture was also needed. Treatment was discontinued temporarily, and all the scaffoldings needed to be removed from time to time during festival period. Another example to pay the respect of the religious culture is to pray for the instruction from gods. After evaluation, the conservator group reached the conclusion that it could be safe and easy to perform treatment if the temple doors were removed and placed horizontally. Generally, it is impossible for a temple to go without door guards for protection. As a result, traditional religious communication was performed for resolution. A pair of crescent-shaped blocks, either made of wood or bamboo, were thrown to answer yes or no for instruction. Each block is round on one side and flat on the other. One block flat and another block round is yes. Both blocks round is a no. Both blocks flat have a different interpretation. Either it can be an emphasized no or a sign that the gods are laughing at the question. While the ceremony was conducted, no definite answer was given until project assistant Mei Li came to pray for instruction. In the end, the doors were able to be removed for treatment purposes. Here are photos of ceremony for the door removal and door guards before and after treatment. Understanding culture is sometimes necessary to gain mutual trust among different groups. 2 weeks ago, I attended the third Applebaum meeting organized by the University of Melbourne and held at the Applebaum University in Thailand. In the end, Jacinta Brown, a textile conservator working in Laos, proposed that cultural guidelines might be really helpful for a conservator working in a foreign country. Nowadays, physical barriers are less significant. Technology not only makes our life easier, it also makes the world smaller than ever. The opportunity of encountering the different cultures increases, and the goal of conservation can be achieved if communication continues among groups. In the end, it helps us obtain general consent and formulate conclusions. This, in turn, brings peace of mind to all. Thank you.
I have a comment for the panel. I wanted to thank James, especially for his plea for bilingualism. As a journalist who has changed careers to come to this field and become a book conservator, I find that's one of our great weaknesses, is that although we bring such interesting combinations of skills to this field, including our ability to speak and communicate, as well as our ability to work with our hands and obviously with our brains and to understand science, often we get so wrapped up in our ability to understand and appreciate the technical that we fail to communicate on a very basic level with people who don't have that technical background and frankly aren't that interested in it. And so I do think that part of our outreach has to be engaging with the public, like Terry just said, and finding what their interest is in what we're doing and remembering that it's the story of the long-term preservation of objects. Why are they exciting to the public? It's probably not how much acid they have in them. And being able to engage with them on their level. And so I thank you for bringing that to the attention, and I think it also ties in very much with what the keynote speaker said. We have a duty to tell the story, not only of chemical deterioration and the really cool toys we have to play with in stopping it, but why it's important to people at large. Thanks.
I guess I just want to say that that seems right to me, and I think everybody in this room you have the resources to tell that story and to practice this more colloquial language. It's not that, I mean, you don't have to go so far as I did in the kind of crazy, wild-eyed thoughts that I have at the end of my talk, about empty museums and bird flu. Don't need to go that far. I think everybody in this room, you're big-brained mammals, and you can tell your story.
Do you choose to exhibit a non-faded watercolor because it's at virtually the beginning of its life, or do you choose to exhibit a faded watercolor because it's approaching or already has reached the end of its life? And if we extend it or make the analogy of James's staples, is a faded watercolor equal to the rusted patina of the staples?
I think to answer the first part of your question, the idea of thinking of objects having a lifespan or a duration, to avoid the biological analogy, is part of the point is to think about the idea of objects having a life before they enter the museum, and that's part of the decision about how to use them, and also part of our efforts to determine their fitness for use. And so, a Rembrandt painting that's acquired by a museum 5 years ago obviously had a life long before it entered a collection, and we all know that. And we don't know what its life was necessarily unless it has a pristine provenance with exceptional notes about its, where it was living and what the climate was, which is impossible to have. And so I think what I'm really trying to argue for is more of a discourse with other members of the museum community beyond conservation about this notion that objects had a life before they entered the museum. They have a different life now that they're in a museum, but that ultimately it's about determining the physical characteristics of the objects that are in the collections now and determining what kinds of use that we might put them through as museum curators or other kinds of professionals will cause the object to go through in the future. So I think that's more how I've thought about it, that the lifespan doesn't begin when it enters the collection. unless it was commissioned by the museum, of course. And then we're lucky.
I'll just piggyback just really quickly on Katie's smart thoughts. The only thing I would say is probably not going to be very satisfying. I think that there aren't algorithms when it comes to making decisions like this. I think that you have to do the hard work. You have to think hard. You have to try to balance the meanings, the values, and you have to make smart, informed judgments. And that's not going to. It's not going to issue in, like I just suggested. It's not going to issue in algorithms. There aren't formulae that you can crank through. Maybe that. It's not very satisfying, but it seems to me the fact of the matter.
Yeah. I think there's also a danger in putting too many numbers on our objects. And I say this as someone who's researching color change in photographs, so I'm putting numbers on color shifts all the time. But there are fuzzy edges on all of those numbers, and that can be really dangerous, actually, I think, to impart very hard numbers to people who don't know the technology that we're used to dealing with. So it's a nuanced problem, and even a single set of, color change values is not going to fully illustrate the point we need to make.
Okay, we have a question over here, and then over here.
Something we see a lot in pop culture these days are shows. It started with Antiques Roadshow, and of course there's been an explosion lately in reality shows of things like American Pickers and people going into barns and finding treasures and then talking about monetary value, historical value, that sort of thing. And it touches in many ways on a lot of what you were talking about on objects as economics and lifespans and outreach and advocacy for conservation and public perception, and also what the keynote speaker was talking about in terms of exposure and how people are gaining information. And I'm just looking for a comment from you about how have you seen those sort of shows and those sort of attitudes brought by the people who are in them coming into the museum in terms of visitorship or the trustees or people you deal with and talk to about conservation, and how that, and whether you think the conservation as a field has any, or in terms of research or outreach and advocacy, needs to, the word I'm going to use is probably not the word I want to use, but it's the only one coming to my mind at the moment, and that is combat these shows and some of the attitudes they might have that we kind of look at and think, ugh. So.
Yeah, I actually recently saw the Kino Brothers show. Is it Treasure Hunting or something along those lines? It's a little scary from our perspective to watch those shows. And one of my favorite quotes from sort of a call from the outside, someone was calling once at a long time ago, actually, at a different job than I had, where they had something that they thought was valuable, and it was an old print, I believe, and the woman explained to me that it's in really bad condition, and I know it's old, so it's got to be valuable. So, it's that, sort of equating poor condition, evidence of age with a monetary value, which is not only actually erroneous if you're thinking about it from an art market perspective, but so it's just so outside of the way we think about objects. But I do think it's the way most people do. And I think cutting that cord completely will be really difficult. I think it's about broadening the conversation, as everybody here has talked about. And yes, monetary value is a part of art. Most art exists because it was commissioned by someone with money. As cynical as it is to sort of say that, it's kind of true. So I think it's difficult. It's easier for us who have a connection with these objects to sort of divorce them from their monetary value. But for most people, it's part of the whole package. It's difficult. I agree.
And I would like to say that I think that conservators have a great role to play in trying to educate the public. I think that AIC has a tremendous role to play to try to educate and advocate for understanding a broader set of ethics for objects like what you're seeing on like American Restoration or Pickers. At the same time, there's also a full spectrum of materials we're dealing with in a range of value. You know, the other day I bought a frame at a used store, you know, a new-to-you type store, and I thought, well, I could spray paint this frame. And then like, no, I can't do that. I just can't do that. So it's sitting in my house just like it came from there.